Chapter 8. Shortened Distance. Adrift in Sandstorms. Even though it's rogue records and rumors you read, the kingdom of Banyue certainly existed, Shilian explained. Oh? Sanlong said. Just then, Nanfeng completed an interweaving array on the ground and called out to the others in the room. It's done. When shall we go? Shilian picked up a small bag and came to the door. Let's go now. He placed his hand on the door and recited, By the heaven official's blessings, no paths are bound. Then he pushed gently. When the door was pushed open, it was no longer a small hillside village outside. What replaced it was a wide city avenue. As wide as the streets were, there was barely anyone on the roads. Maybe one or two pedestrians every now and then. This wasn't only because it was late in the evening, but because the population in the far northwest was already small, on top of being this close to the Gobi. Even in broad daylight, there wouldn't be many walking about. Shilian closed the door behind him, and it was no longer Pucci Shrine on the inside, but a small inn. That one step certainly was thousands of miles. The miracle of teleportation array. A couple of pedestrians walked by, grumbling as they stared at them, appearing quite guarded. Sanlong spoke up from behind Shilian. According to historical records, when the moon sinks in the sky, follow the North Star and you'll come upon the kingdom of Banyue. Gaga, look. Sanlong pointed to the sky. There's the North Star. Shilian looked up and smiled. It's so bright. Sanlong stepped closer to stand beside Shilian. He cast a glance at him, then looked up too. Yeah, it seems the night sky in the northwest is somehow more uplifting than in the Central Plains. Shilian agreed, and the two became immersed in a serious discussion on stars and the night sky. Meanwhile, the two junior officials behind them watched in disbelief. Nanfeng questioned, Why is he here too? The door you created looked so magical, I followed along to check it out, Sanlong replied innocently. Check it out? Do you think this is a fun tour? Nanfeng shouted angrily. Shilian rubbed his forehead and said, Let it go. Since he's here, he's here. He won't eat your rations. I should have enough. Sanlong, stay close to me. Don't get lost. Okay, Sanlong responded, looking obedient and good. This isn't a question of rations. Shilian sighed. Nanfeng, please keep it down. It's the middle of the night. Everyone is sleeping. Let's just focus on the task at hand and stop sweating the small stuff. Let's go. The four followed the North Star and traveled northward. After walking nonstop for an entire night, the towns and greenery along the way became more and more sparse, and the ground slowly gave way to sand. Finally, they reached the Gobi Desert. Although the teleportation array could cross them over 500 kilometers in one step, it used an exhaustive amount of spiritual power. The farther one went, the more spiritual power it sapped, and the time it took to restore the spiritual power was also lengthened. This one step Nanfeng helped them take would require at least several hours to recover from. To conserve strength in case of unforeseen battles, Shilian decided not to have Fuyao perform the same conjuring. For a journey such as this, someone must have their spiritual powers at full strength. In the desert climate, the difference between night and day was extreme. The nights were freezing to the bone, but not too bad. However, when it came to day, it was another matter. The sky was clear and cloudless, giving way to a scorching sun. It was as if they were walking in a steaming oven, cooking them alive from the ground. Shilian led the way, using the direction of the wind and small vegetation growing under rocks to find their path. After a while, he looked back, worried that someone may not be able to keep up. Nanfeng and Fuyao were obviously fine, but, being immortal and all, seeing Sanlong, though, made him laugh. Under the blazing sun, the youth had peeled off his outer red tunic and was using it to lazily block the sun, looking tired and cranky. His skin was pearl white and his hair coal black, and the red tunic covering his face, his features seemed even more accentuated. Shilian removed his bamboo hat and put it on Sanlong's head. Here, I'll lend it to you. Sanlong blinked, then a moment later he smiled. It's all right, he said and returned the hat to him. Shilian didn't argue. If the boy didn't need it, there was no need to push. Let me know if you need it then, Shilian said. Shilian straightened the hat on his own head and continued walking. After a while, the group noticed a small gray building in the midst of the sand. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be an abandoned inn. Shilian looked to the sky and saw that it was just past noon and time for the worst of the heat. They had walked all night. It was time for a break. Shilian led the group inside, and they found a table to sit and settle at. Shilian took out a water bottle from his bag and handed it to Sanlong. Do you want some? Sanlong nodded. He reached for the water bottle and drank from it before Shilian took it back to drink for himself. He gulped down the water, his Adam's apple rolling up and down as he drank. He felt the coolness pass down his throat, incredibly refreshing. Next to him, Sanlong had his arm propping up his chin, stealing glances as Shilian drank. A moment later, he asked, "Is there any more?" Shilian wiped away the bit of water that was caught on his moistened lips, and then nodded and passed over the water bottle again. Sanlong was about to reach for it when another hand blocked him from the water bottle in Shilian's grip. "Hang on," Fu Yao said. He retrieved his own water bottle from his sack and put it on the table, pushing it towards Sanlong. "I have one too. Go ahead." Shilian immediately knew what he was planning. Knowing Fu Yao's personality, there was no way he would ever share his water bottle. He and Nanfeng had talked about testing Sanlong the night before, so the liquid in the bottle must be unmasking water. If a normal human was to drink a potion such as this, nothing would happen. However, if they were anything but human, the unmasking water would force its drinker to reveal their true form. Since Nanfeng and Fu Yao wanted to test to see if this youth was supreme, the effects of the potion had to be considerable. Sanlong smiled. "Guga and I can share one bottle, it's fine." Fu Yao and Nanfeng eyed Shilian, and he thought, "What are you both looking at me for?" Fu Yao said coldly, "His is almost empty. Don't worry. Help yourself." "Really? Then you two go ahead first," Sanlong said, politely declining. Those two both fell silent. A moment later, Fu Yao tried again. "You're a guest. You go first." Fu Yao sounded polite and well-mannered, but Shilian thought he must have squeezed those words through his teeth. Sanlong also made a please gesture. "You two are followers of the host. Please drink first, otherwise it'd be indecent of me." Shilian watched the three of them play this silly game of false pleasantries and pitied the sad water bottle being roughly pushed around the table with barely hidden force. He shook his head. He could feel the poor table trembling from their power play and feared it might not have long to live. The secret battle went back and forth for several rounds when finally Fu Yao snapped and sneered, "You're not accepting the water means you have a guilty conscience." Sanlong replied with a smile, "You're unfriendly and refuse to drink first. Who knows if you poisoned the water? Maybe you're the one with the guilty conscience." Fu Yao pointed at Shilian. "You can very well ask him whether this water is pointed." "Is the water poisoned, Giga?" Sanlong turned to Shilian. It was quite the cunning question. Technically, unmasking water was a potion that exposed one's true form and didn't harm real people. Shilian replied slowly, "It's not poisoned, but..." Fu Yao and Nanfeng focused their glare on Sanlong, and he surprisingly let go of his grip on the bottle. "All right." Sanlong grabbed the bottle and shook it playfully in his hand. "If Guga says it's okay, I'll take a drink." He gulped down the contents of the bottle in one go. Shilian didn't think he'd be so straightforward and was shocked. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were stunned too and tensed immediately. Yet who knew after Sanlong drank all that unmasking water, he shook the bottle again, then threw it over his shoulder, where it crashed and shattered. "Tastes bad." Bewilderment flashed across Fu Yao's face when he saw that unmasking water did nothing to Sanlong. A moment later, he replied coolly, "It's only water. Doesn't it all taste the same? What difference is there?" Sanlong reached for the water bottle next to Shilian's elbow again and replied, "Of course it's different. This one tastes much better." Shilian smiled despite himself. Sanlong really didn't care about any challenges being thrown his way, nor did he care about his true identity. So, other than entertainment, this fight was meaningless. Shilian thought that would be the end of it, but Nanfeng stood up, dropped a sword onto the table with a loud clang. With such a strong battle aura surrounding him, at first Shilian thought Nanfeng intended to end Sanlong for good. It left him speechless for a moment. "What are you doing?" "The road ahead is dangerous," Nanfeng stated darkly. "This is my gift to our little buddy for self-defense." The sheath of the sword was ancient in design and bore wear and tear from the passing of ages. It was no ordinary sword. Shilian's eyes widened in recognition, and he put his hand over his forehead and turned away. He muttered to himself, "It's Hongjing." The name of the sword was indeed Hongjing, meaning red mirror. It was a sacred sword. When it could not fight evil, no evil could escape its spiritual mirror. Should any non-human entities pull it from its sheath, the blade would turn red as if covered in blood, and the crimson blade would reflect the true form of that which unsheathed it. Whether wrath or supreme, no one could escape. There were no young men who would not be interested in swords or horses. So, Sanlong appeared rather intrigued. "Oh, let me see." Sheath in one hand, hilt in the other, Sanlong pulled up the sword. Nanfeng and Fu Yao stared stared intently. But when merely 8 centimeters of the sword were pulled out, Sun Lung laughed. Gaga, are your servants playing a joke on me? Shulian cleared his throat and turned back around. Sun Lung, I already told you they're not servants. Then he spun back. Who's joking around with you? Nanfeng demanded coldly. How can one defend oneself with a broken sword? Sun Lung sheathed the sword and threw it back onto the table. Nanfeng's face froze for a moment. Then he immediately picked up the sword to check. He pulled it from the sheath and heard a clunk, and suddenly, in his hands was a sharp and chilling, broken sword. Hongjing's blade was broken 8 centimeters down. Nanfeng's face changed colors, and he turned the sheath upside down. There was a clattering sound of a mess of clinks and clanks. What was left of the blade within the sheath was now broken into bright, sharp little fragments. The Hongjing sword was a powerful weapon that could expose its enemies. That wasn't a lie. But Nanfeng had never heard of any technique that could break it from within the sheath. Nanfeng and Fu Yao both pointed at Sun Lung and cried, You! Sun Lung snickered and leaned back in his chair, putting his black-booted feet up on the table. He tossed one of the broken pieces in his hand in the air to play with. I'm sure you guys didn't do this on purpose, and you just weren't careful enough with it on the road. Don't worry about me. I don't need some broken sword as protection. Keep it for yourselves. As for Shulian, he simply couldn't look at Hongjing directly. The sacred sword used to be part of Junwu's collection. During the first ascension, Shulian once visited Junwu's palace and thought that, despite its lack of combat power, Hongjing was an interesting sword, so Junwu gifted it to him. After the first banishment, there was a time when things had gotten really hard, and Shulian gave the sword to Feng Xin to be pawned. That's right, pawned. The money made from pawning Hongjin was enough to fill their stomachs for a few meals. Shulian had pawned off too many treasures during that time, and he had forced himself to forget every single one of them, lest his heart bleed with regret. Feng Xin remembered the sword after his ascension, and couldn't bear having a sacred object lost among the mortals, so he managed to find it again, and it was sharpened, cleaned, and hung in the palace of Nanyang. And now, it had been brought down by Nanfeng. In any case, whenever Shulian saw that sword, his head would faintly ache, so he could only look away. He could sense that the other three were about to start bickering again, and shook his head. Instead, he carefully observed the weather outside. The wind was picking up, Shulian noticed. There might be a sandstorm later. If they continued on their way, would they be able to find shelter? Just then, over the golden sand, 2 shadows suddenly flashed by. Shulian straightened up immediately. 2 silhouettes, one black, one white, sauntered unhurriedly but rapidly, as if they were gliding through clouds. The one dressed in black was slender and elegant. The one dressed in white, on the other hand, was a female cultivator, with a sword on her back and a whisk in hand, and they sped by the abandoned inn. The black figure didn't look back once, but the white figure glanced over and smiled. That smile was like their forms, gone in a flash, but leaving a forebodingly strange feeling. It was only because Shulian had been keeping an eye on the outside that he caught the scene. But the other 3 probably only saw their retreating backs. Nanfeng rose instantly. Who was that? Shulian stood up. Don't know, but they're definitely not ordinary people. After a moment's deliberation, he said, The wind is picking up. Stop playing around. Let's go as far as we can. Although the bickering trio constantly argued, they had nevertheless steeled their hearts to do what they came here to do. So they immediately stopped butting heads and cleaned up the pieces of Hongjing before heading out the door. The 4 of them continued their trek, now against a blowing headwind. They walked for another 4 hours, wind howling in their ears, but the progress they made was nothing compared to the distance they were able to cover earlier in the day. The whipping gusts grew stronger, and the winds whipping the sand battered their faces and bodies, beating at any uncovered skin. The more they advanced, the more difficult it became. Gusts became deafening gales, and whirling sand filled the air around them, obscuring their path. Shulian, holding his bamboo hat, called down, This sudden sandstorm feels strange. No one answered him, and Shulian looked back, afraid that someone might be lost. But all 3 were present and following, just no one had heard him. The gales were so strong that his voice was swallowed up. He wasn't particularly worried about Nanfeng and Fu Yao. Even with the crazed winds whipping, the 2 walked steadily, full of killing intent. Sanlong, on the other hand, followed closely behind Shulian, never more than 5 steps away. Even with so much sand blowing and thrashing about, Sanlong remained calm and collected, his hands clasped behind him as he walked. His red tunic and black hair danced wildly in the wind, as if he hadn't any care in the world. Shulian could feel how hard the sand was hitting his face and was worried how little Sanlong seemed to mind. He opened his mouth to tell the youth to watch out for sand getting in his eyes and sleeves, but figured he wouldn't hear anything he'd say, so Shulian reached over directly to help fold in his sleeves, patting them down to make sure no sand would get in. Sanlong was taken aback by the sudden gesture. The two behind them approached, and with everyone in better hearing range, Shulian tried talking again. "Be careful, everyone. This wind came out of nowhere. It's not right. There may be evil within." "It's just a little sandstorm. How evil can it be?" Fu Yao said. Shulian shook his head. "The wind is all right. It's what the sand might carry that I'm worried about." Just then, a powerful gust whipped by, blowing off Shulian's bamboo hat. If it flew off, it would disappear into the desert forever. But Sanlong reacted immediately and grabbed the hat just in time with an abnormally fast hand. He returned the bamboo hat to Shulian once more, and Shulian thanked him. As he retied the hat onto his head, he said, "We should probably find shelter for the time being." Fu Yao countered, "If there's evil in this sandstorm, stop trying to stop us from advancing, then we must continue." Before Shulian could say anything, Sanlong burst out laughing. Fu Yao's head shot up, and he coldly demanded, "What are you laughing at?" Sanlong folded his arms and chuckled. "Does being contradictory give you the satisfaction of feeling unique and independent?" Shulian had thought before that, although this youth was always smiling, it was often difficult to discern whether it was genuine or purposely courteous as a form of mockery. This time, however, anyone could tell there was not a trace of sincerity in his smile. Fu Yao's eyes grew dark, and Shulian raised his hand. "Stop right there, you two. If you've got things to say, you can say them later. It won't be funny if the wind gets any stronger." "What? You think it'll blow you away?" Fu Yao mocked. "Yes, that very Melway Shulian didn't finish before the 3 in front of him suddenly vanished. Actually, they weren't the ones who vanished. He did. Another powerful gust had carried him away for real. A twister. Shulian spun wildly in the sky. He threw out his arm and cried, "Roya, grab hold of something dependably solid!" Roya shot out from within Shulian's sleeve. In the next moment, he could feel the other end of the white bandage sink as if it was tied to something, and it yanked him to a stop. After finally stabilizing himself in the crazed wind, Shulian realized that he had been blown over 30 meters above the ground. Shulian was now like a kite, attached to the ground by only a single thread, with sand whipping at his face. He held fast and tried to see what exactly Roya had tied itself to, squinting and blinking. Shulian finally recognized a red silhouette. The other end of Roya seemed to be wrapped around the wrist of the youth in red. Shulian told Roya to grab hold of something dependably solid, and it grabbed onto Sanlong. Shulian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was about to command Roya to grab onto something else when the pull on his arm suddenly grew lighter. Shulian's heart sank. This wasn't the feeling of Roya being released, but something much worse. Sure enough, the red silhouette suddenly grew closer and was soon within reach. Sanlong had been dragged into the windstorm too. Shulian tried to shout, "Don't panic!" to him, but the moment he opened his mouth, he got another mouthful of sand. At this point, Shulian had gotten used to eating sand. He wanted to tell Sanlong not to panic, but in all honesty, he didn't think the boy would fret in the slightest. Roya continued to withdraw back to Shulian, closing the distance between him and the boy who had been blown into the sky. As he suspected, Sanlong didn't look the least bit anxious, appearing as if he could calmly open a book and read right then and there. Shulian wondered if Sanlong had gotten dragged in on purpose. Roya wrapped itself around the waists of the two to tie the two of them together. Shulian hugged onto Sanlong, then commanded, "Go, try again, but don't bring up any more people." The silk band shot out once again, but this time it grabbed on to Nanfeng and Fu Yao. Shulian felt drained. "Roya," he said tiredly, "I said no people, but I didn't mean it so literally." "All right." Shulian twisted himself to the ground and shouted, "Nanfeng, Fu Yao, hang on tight." Down below, of course, Nanfeng and Fu Yao did their utmost to try to anchor themselves, but the winds were simply too strong. Soon, to no one's surprise, another 2 silhouettes joined them in the twister. Now all 4 of them were swirling about in the air at high speeds. Within the dark yellowness between the heavens and the earth, that twister was like the slanted sand pillar reaching the sky. 4 silhouettes tied together by a white silk band were whirling nonstop within it, going faster and faster, higher and higher. "How did you both get blown up here too?" Julien shouted, enduring all the sand blowing into his mouth. All they could see was sand, and all they could hear was wind. They had no choice but to use their loudest voices to shout to reach each other. "Ask your dumb Roya!" Fu Yao called back, spitting out sand as quickly as he got mouthfuls of it. Julien seized his dumb Roya with both hands and said woefully, "Roya, all 4 of us are counting on you now. Please absolutely do not grab the wrong thing again. Now go!" With heroic solemnity, Julien released Roya once more. "Stop relying on that toy! Think of something else!" Nanfeng roared. But just then, Julien felt a tug on the other end of the silk band and lit up. "Wait, give it one more chance. It caught something." "It better not be a random passerby. Let the poor person go!" Fu Yao roared too. Julien was also afraid of the same thing. He tugged back at Roya, but it remained taut and firm. Julien let out a breath of relief. "It's not. It's something solid, quite stable." Then he commanded Roya, "Pull!" Roya rapidly shortened against the force of the crazed twister. The 4 silhouettes were quickly pulled out of the wind pillar, and gradually, in the midst of the boundless yellow sand, Julien could make out the contours of something large, black, and round, and half round down below. This landmark was extremely big, about the size of a small temple. It was what Roya had latched onto. When they came closer to the ground, Julien could finally see clearly that this round structure was actually a giant boulder. In a windstorm of such force, this boulder was like a solid, silent fortress, no doubt the perfect shelter. While on the road earlier, however, none of them had seen such a rock. Who knew how far this strange twister had taken them? When they landed, they immediately circled around to the back of the boulder to shelter from the wind. The moment they went around, understanding dawned on Julien. Thank the heaven officials' blessings! Turned out, in the back of this boulder, there was an opening. The hole was as wide as 2 doors, but only half the height of one. Although a bit low, it was still possible for a grown person to enter if they bent down. The hole's opening was jagged and slanted, but it appeared to be haphazardly man-made rather than naturally formed. When Julien entered, he discovered that the inside of the boulder was hollowed out, and quite deep. It was dark further inside, so he didn't bother trying to look around, and settled down where there was light. He brushed the sand off Roya and wiped it and wrapped it back on his wrist. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were both spitting out sand and covered in it from head to toe, their eyes to their ears, to their mouths and noses, and all over their clothes. They peeled off their outer robes and shook them out. They were heavy with fine grains of sand. Of the 4 of them, only Sanlang looked unruffled as he lazily dusted himself off and made himself proper again. Other than his lopsided ponytail, his carefree form remained unscathed, unaffected. That ponytail had been tied by Julien and was askew to begin with, so a little wind made no noticeable difference anyway. Nanfeng wiped his face and started cursing while Julien dumped sand from his bamboo hat. "I didn't think you 2 would get pulled in as well. Why didn't you use the 1,000-pound weight spell?" "We did. It was useless," Nanfeng spat angrily. From the side, Fu Yao was still ferociously shaking sand out of his outer robe, and said equally ferociously, Where do you think we are? This is a desert in the northwest, not the main domain of my general." Nanfeng continued, "The north is the territory of the 2 generals Pei, and the west belongs to Kong Yizhen. You won't find a Nanyang temple within a 100-kilometer radius of this place." There is a saying in the mortal realm that even a powerful dragon cannot win against the local snakes. As Nanfeng and Fu Yao were deputy generals of the southeast and southwest, it couldn't be helped that their powers were restricted when they tried to use them outside of their own territories. Seeing this incredibly sullen, frustrated faces, Julien thought that this was perhaps the first time they were sent flying by a huge wind to tumble in circles without any way to land. "You 2 have worked very hard." Sanlang sat down next to him and propped up a cheek with his hand. "So are we just going to sit here until the storm blows over?" "Looks like we'll have to." Julien turned to him and replied, "As strong as that twister is, it can't possibly blow a giant rock into the sky." "You never know. Like you said, there's certainly something off about that wind." A sudden thought came to Julien. "Sanlang, may I ask you a question?" "Ask away," Sanlang replied. "That state preceptor of Banyue, is it a man or a woman?" Julien asked. "Did I not mention earlier? She's a woman." Just as I suspected, Julien thought. "Earlier, when we were resting at that abandoned inn, didn't we see 2 figures pass by? Their steps were graceful and strange. Definitely not those of a mortal. and the one in white was a female cultivator. Fu Yao looked doubtful. It's not easy to identify whether they were a man or woman by the robes, and they looked taller than the average woman. Are you sure you saw right? I'm absolutely sure, Shilian said. So I thought she might be the state preceptor of Banyue. It's possible, Nanfeng said, but there was another black-clad figure traveling with her. Who could that be? Hard to say, but the person was walking even faster than she was. Their strength is definitely no less than hers, Shilian said. Could it have been the other evil state preceptor, Fengshin? Fuya wondered. I think regarding that, the whole dual evil masters title was only given because historically their actions were similar. Both were equally evil, so people connected them together like a pair to remember them and more easily, like the four great calamities of the ghost realm. Even if there aren't really four that fit, they're made for because it's simpler. Hearing Shilian say this, Sanlong burst out laughing. Shilian stared at him. It's nothing, Sanlong said. I just thought what you said made sense. One of the four in the great calamities is certainly only there for the head count. Please continue. Shilian continued. In reality, dual evil masters have nothing to do with each other. I've heard of the state preceptor Fengshin. He was the state preceptor of Yong'an, born at least 100 years earlier than the state preceptor of Banyue. You don't know the four great calamities in the ghost realm, but you know about the state preceptor Fengshin of Yong'an in the mortal realm? Fu Yao asked in disbelief. I overhear things while collecting scraps in the mortal realm. It's not like I collect scraps in the ghost realm, so of course I don't learn anything about them, Shilian explained. The wind outside the cave seemed to be dying down. Nanfeng approached the opening of their shelter, patting the rocky surface here and there, inspecting its material. He stared fixated at it for a moment, then lowered his head. Why would there be a hollow rock like this in the middle of a desert? He thought the boulder was rather suspicious, but Shilian wasn't surprised by it. Hollowed boulders like these aren't unusual. The people of Banyue used to build shelters like these to hide from sandstorms, or even for passing the nights while taking their livestock to graze. Some holes weren't dug, but rather blown out, Shilian said. How could they graze in a desert? Nanfeng asked confused. Shilian smiled. It wasn't all desert here 200 years ago. There used to be an oasis. Guga, Sanlong called. What is it? Shilian turned his head. Sanlong raised his hand and pointed. The rock you're sitting on seems to have writing on it. What? Shilian looked down, then stood up and found that where he had been sitting was actually a carved stone monument. After wiping off the layer of dust, there were indeed letters on its surface. However, the characters were carved rather shallowly, so the words weren't very clear. At least half the steel was buried, and the words stretched from beneath the sand all the way up until they faded into blackness. If there was writing here, it had to be examined. I don't have much power left. Can someone lend me a palm light? Thanks, Shilian asked. Nanfeng snapped his fingers, and a small burst of flame ignited in his palm. Shilian stole a glance at Sanlong, but the youth didn't appear surprised. Shilian supposed that after seeing the teleportation array, there wasn't much more to be surprised about. Nanfeng moved his palm to where Shilian directed him to write in the writing on the stone steel. The characters were incredibly odd, slanted as if randomly scribbled by a toddler. What is this? Nanfeng wondered. Banyue script, duh, Sanlong replied. I'm sure Nanfeng asked the meaning of the words, Shilian said. Let me see. Shilian dusted more sand off the stone steel, revealing the first column of writing with the largest characters. That had to be the heading. The same characters also appeared repeatedly in various sections of the text. Fu Yao approached and produced a palm torch. You know how to read Banyue script? Truth be told, I collected scraps in Banyue before that evil master of Banyue, or whoever, came about, Shilian replied. Is there something wrong? Nothing, Fu Yao humped. Just wondering where you haven't collected junk. Shilian flashed a smile, then looked down again at the characters. A moment later, he suddenly said, General. What? Nanfeng and Fu Yao answered at the same time. Shilian looked up. The first word on the stone steel is general. He paused for a moment. But there's another character after it that I'm unsure the meaning of. Nanfeng seemed to sigh in relief. Then you'd best look some more. Shilian nodded, and Nanfeng shifted his palm over further to light up the other words. Something didn't feel right, Shilian thought. There seemed to be something else on the periphery of his vision. With both hands pressed on the rock, Shilian slowly looked up. Above the stone steel, the flickering flames illuminated a stiff human face. This face with its bulging eyes was staring straight at him. Ah! The one who screamed wasn't Shilian or Nanfeng, but that stiff face. Nanfeng immediately took out his other hand to ignite it as well. He put both hands together and grew the flames until they were bright enough to light up the entire cave. The one whose face was revealed by the light was a person who had been hiding in the shadows the whole time. When the flames grew bigger, he scurried along the walls toward the back of the cave. And there, Shilian saw 7 or 8 people huddled together and trembling in fear. "Who are you?" Nanfeng shouted. Nanfeng's angry shout echoed in the cave, and Shilian, whose ears were still ringing from the sandstorm earlier, covered his ears. Noise from the windstorm had deafened them, and anything spoken too softly wasn't heard. After they entered the cave, they had discussed the evil master of Banyue, then focused their attention on deciphering the stone seal, so no one had noticed there were others also hiding within their shelter. The 7 or 8 people trembled. A moment later, an elder of 50 or so years stammered, "We're a merchant caravan passing through the area. Just ordinary merchants. The sandstorm is too fierce, so we're hiding in here for the time being." He was the most composed in the group, and by the looks of it, the leader. Nanfeng asked, "If you're just ordinary merchants, why are you sneaking around, hiding so furtively?" The elder was about to respond when a youth of around 17 years shouted, "We weren't planning on sneaking around, but you guys suddenly rushed in here. Who knows whether you're good or evil? Then we heard you talk about the evil master of Banyue, then some ghost realm stuff, and you ignited fire in your palms. We thought you guys were Banyue's soldiers out patrolling and hunting for flesh. No way we'd make a sound." "Stop talking, Tiansheng." The old man hushed the boy, afraid that he might have offended the other party. The youth had thick brows and large eyes, with the face and mind of a tiger. As soon as an elder spoke, he shut up immediately. Shilian put down his hands, his ears no longer ringing, and said amiably, "It's nothing but a misunderstanding. Just a misunderstanding. Let's all relax a bit. No need to be so nervous." He paused for a moment before continuing to explain, "We're not Banyue soldiers. I am just a cultivator from a small shrine. These are people from my shrine. We only know a few tricks, nothing fancy. You're ordinary merchants, and we're ordinary cultivators without malicious intent. It just so happens that we all entered the same shelter to hide away from the same sandstorm." His voice was soft and gentle, each word spoken slowly to calm everyone's nerves. After much explanation and reassurance, the merchant party finally relaxed.